Hello and welcome to what is officially week 17 of history now. We're 1 week behind according to the book, and I think I put week 17 on last week's history lesson, but this is the real week 17. So hopefully it won't be too darn confusing. We've been sort of at the mercy of Mother Nature lately, but forecast looks like we will be able to meet on Monday. The three segments we're going to cover today, kind of like last week where we kind of jumped around the globe a little bit, we're going to be doing that again this week. And we will open up with a lesson on Good King Wenceslas. If the name rings a bell, that's one thing. If it does not, then perhaps the song that we based his life on will ring a bell. I'm sure you've heard it. Wenceslas's background can be traced back to a couple of people we talked about last week. Remember Cyril and Methodius, who were the first Christian missionaries in the Slavic nations, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, that area, Bosnia, Croatia, and all. They were the ones that developed the Cyrillic alphabet to communicate with those that they were trying to convert. Well, their work, again, was successful insofar as Christianity began to spread throughout the Slavic kingdoms. We go to the region of Bohemia, which is in the modern-day Czech Republic, very close to Germany. So the history of Bohemia kind of borrows from lots of different cultures. The Duke of Bohemia was Wenceslas's father, who was killed in battle when Wenceslas was only 13 years old. With his father's gone, Wenceslas actually moved in with his paternal grandparents, and his paternal grandparents were personally ministered to by Cyrillus and Methodius. So a very direct connection here between the first Christian missionaries in this region and this figure that we're going to learn a lot about. Ludmilla was his grandmother's name, and she planted the seeds of Christianity in Wenceslas when he was very young. And again, when he was 13, his father was killed in battle. It was decided that he would live with his paternal grandparents until he became old enough to rule as the Duke of Bohemia. The arrangement between the grandmother and grandson didn't last very long. There's another character in the story, and that is the mother of Wenceslas. Her name was Dramoria. She did not like the Christian upbringing that Wenceslas was given, so because she was from a strong pagan background, she was not converted to Christianity. And to add to all this tension, Dramoria was going to rule Bohemia until Wenceslas was old enough. So she had she had a vested interest in him not becoming the Duke of Bohemia, and the nobles who surrounded her were all pagan. So you can figure this was pagan rule, and she did not care too much about the possibility of her son turning it into a Christian region. Long story short, Wenceslas's mother had his grandmother killed. And after Ludmilla's death, Wenceslas was brought back under his mother's care, and she tried to get him into pagan worship, but fortunately for Wenceslas, the seed of Christianity had been planted, and she was not successful in turning Wenceslas into a pagan. In the year 922, Dramoria was banished by the authorities for arranging for Ludmilla's murder, and Wenceslas became the rightful Duke of Bohemia at the age of 18, and he became a strong Christian-based ruler. How Christian was he? He forgave his mother for having his grandmother killed. An incredible act of mercy. That was just the beginning. Wenceslas was known for selflessly giving clothes to the needy, shelter to the homeless. He invited more missionaries to come to Bohemia to minister to the people. Now, there, of course, is the Christmas carol you just heard that was written in Wenceslas's memory. The story goes that on a cold night, Wenceslas and a page, a helper, noticed a poor man gathering up firewood. The king asked the page where the man lives. When learning that the poor man lives against a faraway fence, the king instructs the page that they'll go to his house that very night and provide the man with a meal. Page on the way complains about how cold his feet are, so Wenceslas suggests that the page walk in his warm footsteps to lessen the pain of the snow. So the song implies that Wenceslas was so warm-hearted that there was heat in the footsteps that he left behind. And so the song goes. The song wasn't written until the 1800s, but by then, of course, the oral traditions of good King Wenceslas had been handed down through the generations, and in the 1800s, somebody put them to song. The problem, again, goes back to Wenceslas's family. His brother, Boleslav, was a pagan. He listened to Mom. Wenceslas listened to Grandma. The story goes, Boleslav invited Wenceslas to celebrate a feast. Wenceslas was warned by his inner council that his brother might be plotting his death, but he went anyway. On September 28th of the year 929, Boleslav raised his sword against Wenceslas. On the spot, Wenceslas forgave him, right there. But as he turned to walk out of the church, other members of the nobility, who were obviously interested in a pagan future, attacked him and killed him. He was only 25 years old. So a very brief reign for Wenceslas, but he did enough good in those 7 years that he is still remembered in song today. And the region in which he ruled, the Bohemian region, would be a very crucial component of the future of that entire section of Europe. Statue in his memory still stands in Prague in the Czech Republic, and September 28th, the day of his murder, is dedicated as St. Wenceslas Day. Let's move back to the Holy Roman Empire. Remember last week we talked about Charlemagne being crowned by the Pope as the Emperor of Rome in the year 800. That's where historians mark the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, but technically it did not begin until really more than a century later. It gets a little confusing here. Now, again, we talked about it last week in class. The Holy Roman Empire, as it turned out, was not very holy and not very Roman. It was an empire, though. 1 out of 3 ain't bad, I suppose. But let's examine it a little bit more carefully by looking at Otto the Great, Otto the First, if you want to call him that. He was the last king of the East Francia region. That kind of morphed into modern-day Germany. And even today, if you live along the border of France and Germany, you're about 50-50 chance of hearing French spoken as German. It's again, just because there's a national line there doesn't mean that you don't go 2 miles down the road and nobody speaks French. Everybody speaks German. It's sort of inexact, I suppose. Otto, became king of that region, again, sometimes even today called the King of Germany, in the year 936. He was a very successful military commander who united a lot of the dukes, the duchies, and smaller regions within that area under his rule. He expanded Germany by defeating and politically incorporating the Slavs in what's now Poland, the Hungarians in the Battle of Magurs. You don't have to remember all this, but suffice to say that Otto was a very, very successful military commander and really consolidated geographically that region of Germany, modern-day Poland, Hungary, the western or the eastern part of Europe, as we would call it today. Apparently all this wasn't enough for Otto. He began looking at northern Italy. Remember our friend the Papal States? The land that was owned by the church? Well, he decided not to conquer, but he wanted to get it the old-fashioned way. He wanted to marry into it. And so he set his sights on the widow of the king of the Papal States, a woman named Adelaide of Italy. She was a very strong Christian and was actually imprisoned after her father, or her husband rather, the king, died by others who wanted the crown, obviously. There's a very dramatic story about Adelaide escaping from prison by way of a tunnel that ran under the castle where she was being held. From a political standpoint, it made a lot of sense for her to marry this very successful European conqueror for protection. It was enough, Otto had built up a reputation at that point, enough so that the Pope in Rome summoned for his help when there was an uprising in Italy near the Papal States. Otto, being a good military commander and evidently having a pretty good army at his back, won that battle. And of course, remember, in the year 800 AD, when Charlemagne was crowned as Pope, Pope John XII did the same thing to Otto in the year 962. He proclaimed him as Roman Emperor of the West, and his kingdom became known as the Holy Roman Empire. Specifically, he was king of Germany, Bohemia, Burgundy, which is now in France, northern Italy. These lands became the Holy Roman Empire under the rule of Otto I. The term Roman Emperor remained popular with Germans for a very long time, and really up until 1800s, whoever the ruler of Germany was referred to as the Holy Roman Emperor. As for the holiness of the Holy Roman Empire, well, it was kind of skin deep. Otto did try to sway others towards Christianity, but for political gain, and he forced it upon people as well. If you control the church and you can make people Christian, then they are, in a way, under your control. He used brute force to spread Christianity, which, of course, is a perversion of everything Christianity stands for. Again, we've talked about this a lot. It is one of the most distressing parts of history. One of the most depressing parts of being a Christian is coming to grips with the fact that our religion has done some bad things, some terrible things, in the name of our religion. Can't deny it. Despite a lot of flaws with the Holy Roman Empire, It was probably the most prosperous kingdom in all of Europe from, let's say, roughly 955 to 1075 for that 120-year period. It was very powerful, had promoted trade, and was doing a lot of expansion. Otto the First saw to the building of the Abbey of St. Maurice. And in fact, Otto and his descendants, this is a rare case of one's descendants actually being halfway decent administrators and rulers. Otto II, Otto III were also, like their father, committed to learning and to spreading Christianity, unfortunately, by any means necessary. A lot of the next 900 years of European history is going to have something to do with the Holy Roman Empire. And this is how it started. Let's move now to modern-day Russia. An interesting land insofar as, again, Russia is the largest country on earth right now. A lot of it is functionally uninhabitable. It's tundra, the Siberian region. Very hostile, does not produce a lot of life. You can't grow too much. But in the European section of Russia, you have large plains, arable land that you could farm, and you really had kind of a hodgepodge of people that settled in the region before the Dark Ages. We could go back to lots of sort of indigenous people, lots of those from the Orient, China, Japan, and the like, but a lot also from Europe, from Scandinavia. It was a big, big melting pot of a lot of different cultures. Remember our old friend the Goths, one of the groups that really helped take down the Roman Empire? Yeah, there were Goths there. There were Huns there. You remember Attila from a couple centuries before. They had control of the region. This region of Russia, which now includes not just Russia, but the Ukraine, Belarus, been a lot of news around Ukraine lately, had lots of different types of people. And so some of these little mini kingdoms that cropped up in this region were known to have different court systems to administer justice to different people according to their customs. It was really a wild melting pot around the Volga River, the Caspian Sea. And of course, around 900 or so, here come the Vikings from Scandinavia, looking for stuff to pillage, looking for food, looking for land. So by the middle of the 9th century, the Vikings had pretty well looted most of the coastline and had moved into Russia. And they set up in what's now modern-day Ukraine in the city of Kiev. They called themselves the Rus, where we get the name Russia from. There's a whole lot more as we get into a gentleman named Vladimir. We'll talk about more of him in just a second. But this part of the world was starting to be called the Kievan Rus region. And again, lots of different cultures made it up. The Vikings, because they had the bigger swords, were becoming sort of the dominant culture. Vladimir was born about 956, considered the 5th Grand Duke of Kiev. He was a descendant of the first Vikings, actually, that the Swedish Vikings, remember, that came into this part of the world. Vladimir, as a ruler, was religiously curious. He was Christian, but again, we had two major forces of Christianity going on: the Byzantine Empire, aka the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Roman Catholic Church, aka the Western Roman Empire, with the Papal States and the Pope and all that good stuff. So he actually sent representatives to both churches to decide what course that Kievan Rus would take. And they chose the Byzantine Empire. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that it was mainly the architecture of the Byzantine churches, the Gothic architecture, that sold him. So, yeah, a little something to be said for architects. He chose the Eastern Orthodox Church as the overarching religious representation of Kievan Rus. He asked for missionaries from Constantinople to come and help build churches in his kingdom, and some of those churches are still standing, and they are absolute cathedrals. Again, many of them are still being used as cathedrals. Much like Otto the First, though, Vladimir became so adamant about his campaign that he forced Christianity on his people. When he got baptized in 988, he passed a law that made it mandatory for all his subjects to be baptized as well. Again, this problem again, that marrying of the church and the state, where the state mandates religion, which again, if you are a Christian, that goes against everything you were supposed to believe in. But it happened. There was certainly an upside to Vladimir's rule. Again, he was very big on education, built schools and libraries, new cities, promoted trade. He also married a Byzantine princess named Anna to further the solidification or that connection between, again, the crown and the cross. The Kievan Rus was a very thriving culture for about 200 years until more Huns came in and broke it up a little bit. But it's significant because this is the first bit of culture or cultural phenomenon, I guess, that really began to develop modern day Russia, what we associate with Russia today. This was the first really organized nation state within the boundaries of modern day Russia. And as we continue to study history, we will see they have a big, big hand in it. Anyway, we'll talk about more of this madness when we meet on Monday. Have a good weekend.